Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. Looking back on the last 100 years of technological development, there are many dramatic comparisons to draw of then and now. From the Spirit of St. Louis to supersonic stealth bombers. From the discovery of insulin to mRNA vaccines. From a candlestick telephone to a 5G powerhouse in your pocket. Today I'm speaking with Michael Bevington from Electrosensitivity UK about the largely unexpected consequences of a mass deployment of novel technologies across all sectors of society. As reports of sensitivity to Wi-Fi and mobile signals rise, we discuss the recognized restrictions, risks, and reasonable alternatives for public health. And joining me today is Michael Bevington. Michael, hello. For my own information and for everybody listening at home, could you tell me a bit about yourself, your background, and what's led you to our conversation today?
I spent my whole career in teaching, and in 2006, when Wi-Fi was put into my classroom, I went down with some strange, very unpleasant aspects of health. And that really got me involved in the whole issue. To continue teaching, the Wi-Fi had to be removed, mobile phones had to be removed. And since then, I've become part of the charity Electrosensitivity UK, its chair of trustees, and I've researched as much as I can and tried to alert other people as to some of the problems with this technology.
I mean, it's something that you say has affected you personally, but to give us more of a broad scope, could you tell me about the landscape of electrohypersensitivity, its kind of the etiology, how many people across the UK or even globally, if you have the figures, are candidates or affected by this?
Well, every human person, every cell in your body is sensitive to magnetic and electric fields. So we're all sensitive. Of that, about 80% react in adverse ways, which can be shown. About 30% have conscious symptoms, often quite mild. About 3% have strong conscious symptoms, and about 1.6% have severe symptoms. That's taken from figures right around the world. And my reckoning is perhaps 0.65% are then unable to work because of those very severe symptoms they get from being in the presence of man-made radio frequency like Wi-Fi, mobile phones, masks, and things like that. So it's a very wide spectrum, but we're all affected.
Well, you mentioned some of the technologies there, but electromagnetism is it's a big, wide field of physics. So if we can maybe set some terms in terms of what kind of radiation, what kind of frequencies, and what kind of technologies we're going to be talking about in more detail today. Could you walk us through some of the boundaries here?
My understanding is that at very low frequencies, you get what's called both electric and magnetic fields. And those have been known and studied since the 1730s. And interestingly, right at the start, a lot of it was done by the Royal Society at London. But few people began to react to this element of hypersensitivity, which might affect, as I've just said, some 1 to 3% of the population. And we still don't quite understand how that's triggered, but it's certainly there. And it is obviously a growing problem in the modern world. So those are low frequencies, things like power lines and the electricity and cables running around your house. What I suppose affects more people these days are the radio frequencies. So those are much faster, if you like, variations on the stream that comes out from the transmitter. And they're not as fast as the ionizing radiation, which is what you get from gamma rays, X-rays, things like that. Then you can get things like the sun's rays, and below that, infrared, and then you come into the radio frequency. So we're talking about things we can't see, and most people can't feel, but a few can. But as I say, are affecting our cells. It's complicated because, in fact, mobile phone signals use a transmitter frequency, which might be 2.45 gigahertz for Wi-Fi, that type of thing, or 5 gigahertz or higher than that. But then on that, they send packets of information. And those packets can be at lower frequencies. So there's two different things which are at interplay with each of your cells. And often it's thought that it's those changes as the packets hit the membrane cell wall, that has a biological effect on you.
To take that biological effect up from the cellular level to the whole person level, what kind of symptoms are associated with EHS?
Probably the most common over the years has been things like headaches, and related to that, any neurological effect. So brain fog, sleep disturbance, could be tinnitus, ringing in the ears. It could be poor eyesight, getting blurred eyes. It can have quite distinct effects like nosebleeds. And if people have certain types of skin conditions, or just certain types of skin probably, or muscles, then it might appear as a rash on your arm or your face or your back. It can occur in terms of the muscle contracting or failing to work. So all sorts of neurological effects, which are physiological. They're nothing to do with the psychology. You can't induce yourself to think of a headache and then get it just because you think you've seen a mobile phone. There's two very distinct conditions. One is this one to do with the physiological reaction, where you can just see it. A lot of the testing, provocation tests, are what they call blinded, where people don't know what's going on, but they still react, and other people can see that, as opposed to ones where they know what's happening. So that is well established. You can do that with animals, sadly, very commonly. They do endless tests on poor mice and rats and put them in mazes and fire this stuff at them and discover that they lose their memory, they lose their learning. And you go on and on. All these different cognitive and neurological effects can affect them. It affects their feeding habits. Digestion is one which is often affected. Balance, spinning of the head. Brain fog is something which is a curious one, which you can get. And loss of spatial awareness, spatial memory, very often common. But you can get words mixed up. All sorts of people with Tourette's can be affected, all sorts of different ways. And as I say, a lot of that you can parallel in the animal kingdom as well.
Now, we are recording this using electronic devices, and you mentioned that Wi-Fi in your school was kind of your first experience of hypersensitivity. But could you tell me, just as someone who is affected, what kind of place technology has in your day-to-day life, and from there we can look into preventative measures, and from there lead into Wi-Fi in schools and controls?
From my own point of view, I try to keep out of what I know is the radiation as much as I can. So I try to avoid using a mobile phone and being close to people who use mobile phones. Try to avoid being in a house with Wi-Fi. I use protective nets. The military know all about this because they use it in warfare. So I use that type of netting, as do many people in this condition. But of course, you immediately realize it's very restrictive. It then means that actually, if you go off to a certain place, you are very limited in what you risk exposing yourself to without having consequences. In my case, I can have the consequences 12, 16 hours after I've been in the place, but I may not feel it at the time. So it's one reason why probably most people who suffer haven't got any idea what they're suffering from, because it is actually quite complex to work out what is triggering it. So I was visiting a picture gallery recently and it seemed to be fine going through all of it, except one end. It just happened to be near the shop, and presumably, I don't know, they had some powerful transmitter down that end, or even more powerful one, and it would affect me. So as long as I kept away from that area, it wasn't too bad. So if I go into a city or an area where I know there might be a lot of Wi-Fi people using their mobile phones, I'll try to wear protective clothing, but that's expensive and it doesn't prevent everything. So it is actually an incredibly limiting situation. And I've got off quite lightly. There are many people out there who end up having to live in a tent in the wilds, in a car out in the forests. And it's when it first hits you and you don't know what it is, and you don't protect yourself enough, the body seems to go into this hyper state. It's very similar to any allergy, where you might have a reaction to, let's say, peanuts or something like that. And if you might tolerate a very low amount, but if you have too much, suddenly the body will trigger itself and go into some hyperreactivity. And when you get into that state, it takes quite a long time for the body to calm down. And all the leading scientists, doctors who are involved in this, say the first thing to do, remove the radiation around you. Get into a situation where you're back to, if you like, back to nature. And the levels we've got are billions of times higher than nature. Human beings just weren't designed for it, nor was nature for that matter, actually. But certainly we weren't designed for it. And for those of us who've got a particular genetic makeup, it can be pretty devastating.
Well, let's talk safety thresholds. Let's talk limits. What has been set out by, I've got a couple of abbreviations here for IARC, NIRP, and other fun acronyms. What has been broadly established as a tolerable amount of radiation? What kind of, I think it's microwatts, the U-watts. What's a safe in, what is the standard allowed dosage, if we will?
There are two viewpoints on this. There's one viewpoint, which is the one I hold, that you can show this affects every cell in the body, and it has adverse effects for a large number of people, and we need to have, therefore, what we call non-thermal and long-term limits. The industry who pump this stuff out, and some governments who obviously benefit from taxation and so forth, want to hold to an invalidated myth, which was put out by a person called Hermann Schwann in 1953, that the only adverse effect is heating. So it's as though you put yourself into your home microwave oven, and therefore you want to prevent people's bodies from being heated by more than either 1 degree in 6 minutes or over 30 minutes, that sort of amount. Of course, when you think about it, that doesn't really explain things like cancers, which aren't caused by heating 1 degree over 6 minutes, whereas that's one of the very well-established effects of radio frequency from mobile phones, masks, and things like that. And it's been known since 1953. Curiously, the very year that this person, Schwann, put out his heating limit. So you do tend to feel that there's one group who want to have it, and aren't too worried about causing harm to other people. And then there's what I would call now the majority scientists who say there are problems here. So if you do it in the electric field, they will allow up to 61 volts per meter. The biological limits are usually set at 0.6 volts per meter. I would say what you need to do is look at the NORL, the no observable adverse effect level. And to my mind, for people like me and those affected by it, it's something like 0.05 volts per meter. And then what you do is you put in a safety barrier after that, and you lower it by 10 times. So you would come out with something like 0.005 volts per meter. If you do it in terms of microwatts or microwatts per meter squared, and you're right, this is incredibly complex. The heating limit, it comes out at something like 10 million or 40 million. And what the Bioinitiative report, one of the mainstream ones, has suggested would be something in the region of 3 microwatts per meter squared. And I might take that down to 0.6 or something like that, or further than that. So you can see there's a very, very, very big divide between the two approaches. And it just seems to me extraordinary that the only thing that many governments protect against is the heating, when it's actually very well known that isn't the main problem. The primary effect of radio frequency are the non-thermal, the non-heating effects. And they're to do with how the cell membranes are affected, polarized, depolarized, which then leads to calcium and other ions ingress into the cell, which leads to triggering of the cellular functions and signals through the body, right through the body. So I think you can see, if you ask the question, what is a safe level, you first have to say, do you believe in just heating effects, or do you accept there are non-heating, non-thermal effects and long-term effects, so that it accumulates over the years. So you can walk past, obviously, a phone mast, and it's not going to cause you cancer if you walk past once. But if you live in a house, let's say 300 meters away, and sleep every night in the beam of that phone mast, then you're up to 10 times more likely to get cancer. But that's over a matter of years, not just one walking past it. So it's a challenge for people doing public health. And at the moment in the UK, we've got it massively wrong. We're only on the heating limits. We're not on the non-heating limits.
I'd only be doing my due diligence if I didn't say that there have been countermanding studies that refute the existence of EHS in the ways that we are talking about, in the ways that you have been experiencing. Is this an absence of evidence or an evidence of absence? To those studies and to those researchers who disagree with your position and the research there is, what do we say to that?
Well, it's very straightforward that there is plenty of evidence that this is occurring. What they like to do is to take a group of people and then try to find out that most of them are reacting to their decided level of radio frequency. And they therefore do what are called provocation studies, as I was just saying. Now, Rees, who did one of the first ones and followed Cyril Smith, what they did was work out what frequency each individual is particularly susceptible to. And then you can get 100% accuracy. But if you do it just as a general broadcast across a random 100 selected people, very often youngsters from university or something like that, they use healthy people, you would, according to my statistics and the ones that they're using, they're only going to be about 1, 2, or 3%, 1 or 2 or 3 out of those 100 who might react. And of course, you might not have any of them in that particular 100. Then they like to average. So if you get 4 or 5 people who react, but 95% don't, they can then say, well, actually, the majority don't react, therefore it's safe. Or they can say, it's happened with some of these tests, the Essex one, people attended, they were badly hurt by it, so they couldn't go on with it, but they were then just dropped out of the equation altogether. What you actually have to do is take each person individually, and some of the most promising of these are the ecological studies, as we call them, where you actually put a receiver on the individual person, then get them to keep a record of when they might feel ill effects and adverse effects, and then see if you can tie the two up. And where they've done that, they've only, on one study, they had 3 people, and 2 people didn't seem to correlate, even though they said they were very sensitive. But most of those exposures were under 0.05 volts per meter. And the one who was living more in a city area and had more exposures at above 0.05 volts did correlate. So that's 1 out of 3 people who were supposed to be highly sensitive, where they were living in an environment where, in fact, they weren't meeting the sort of challenges which they might meet in some other environments. So it's a very challenging issue to work out. It doesn't follow the ordinary linear dose response issue, which again is purely an assumption which some people have made, mainly the governments and the heating lobby, say it must be a linear response. No, they've known for years that actually you get windows of frequencies. So having said that it's not good to live 300 meters from a phone mast, actually it also appears that you get little pockets where you're at much lower levels, and those are much more bioactive, as we call it. They have much more effect on the human body than some higher levels. So it's a massively complex area to get into. And so far, the provocation tests by those sponsored by the wireless or government industries, wireless industries or governments who favour the wireless industries, they haven't wanted to produce any effect which they can see. So they deliberately, as far as we can make out, skewed the results. There was one case where they actually had the phone, or the device which was supposed to be in standby, emitting quite strong signals even when it was in standby. So you get these really quite complex situations which need to be resolved. But as I say, probably the best way for them to go in the future is what they were doing in the 1980s, is to deal with each person individually, so we know at what level they respond. And the other factor which has massively changed the situation in the last 18 months is that two researchers, one very distinguished one in Sweden, have been looking at a whole series, 8 I think they've done now, case studies, which are just like provocation studies, of people who happen to be living or working in apartments where they have put up a 5G mast nearby. It might be, say, 50, 100 meters away on a nearby office building on the top, beaming straight into the windows of someone's flat. And I had a look at these, and it's curious. Usually within 3 weeks, those people who are affected have become seriously ill to the point where they can't continue either to work or live in those apartments or flats, and they have to leave. When they leave, they recover, and most of the ill health disappears again. When they go back into the flat, it starts again. So it's absolutely like a provocation test. And they've got 8 of them now, and it shows that actually it's a major problem. It doesn't happen to everyone, so it doesn't mean that the whole block of flats is emptied. But when it does happen to the individual, it's absolutely devastating. They can't live in their own home because what someone else has done 100 meters away or something like that. And with no proper protection from government or the people who are supposed to be looking after this thing, because they simply say it's all to do with heating, it's not to do with non-heating effects.
Safe buildings to be in leads into the conversations about Wi-Fi in schools and some of your recent publications around that, starting from your own experience as being a teacher who had to stop having Wi-Fi in the school that you were in, to what Wi-Fi in schools looks like, what kind of distribution you see about routers, about mobile phones, and what that means for the people inside of those buildings.
Well, perhaps to start with the actual technology of the Wi-Fi, that produces radio frequency, which is regarded by the World Health Organization and EARC as a 2B possible carcinogen causing cancer. So it's also been confirmed as causing cancer by a study in America required by the FDA and the NTP as a clear cause of cancer. And that's been known since 1953. So it is concerning if schools use Wi-Fi for all the time pupils are there, because it's equivalent, if you like, of putting them in a classroom filled with cigarette smoke or asbestos or something, which is regarded as also a carcinogen. Obviously, if you put people in an area with tobacco smoke, they don't all go down with lung cancer. So we're not saying that everyone automatically goes down with cancers caused by the Wi-Fi, but nevertheless, it is regarded by the experts as capable of causing cancer. It's a curious signal in that it's got a very wide spread, more so than some other signals. And it has initial signal, a sort of handshake signal at 10 hertz, and then it will operate on a carrier frequency, used to be 2.45 gigahertz, some now have gone up to 5 or 6 gigahertz. A lot of the mobile phones use it. So if pupils have or staff have mobile phones in schools, it may divert onto the local Wi-Fi system. Typically in a school, it will be provided via routers or routers on the ceiling, on the walls. But of course, it goes straight through ceilings and walls and people, of course. And so you can't stop it from getting into a classroom by simply putting the device, transmitter, the router, the router in the corridor. It will still go into the nearby classrooms. And if it's in one classroom, it can go into the next classroom and so on. In terms of health effect, obviously I went down with it. Many people are affected by it consciously, and a small number to the point where life becomes very difficult. There was a case which I heard of where a child, we wouldn't know anything about this, so it's not, suppose, which is what the industry would like to think. It's caused by a psychological fear of routers. Anyway, this poor child was ill I think it was a Monday afternoon, And the parents couldn't work out why she came back saying, "Oh, I've got a terrible headache. I can't stand that lesson." They thought it was a lesson. Then turned out that it was an IT lesson. They'd been taken off to an IT room, and this poor child was being forced to sit near to a Wi-Fi router or router. And so once that's known, then of course the teachers could help make sure the child was either as far as possible from it or not in that particular classroom. So it is actually quite complex to work out sometimes how people are going to be affected. And that's where, when you come to a school, you have to have risk assessments for most things. Now, it's very curious because when you think about this, there are two big organizations which have looked at trying to produce some sort of risk assessment. One is ICNIRP, which is a private organization from Germany and very much favors the wireless industry. But in 2002, they produced their general principles and said there are people who are vulnerable, who suffer from effects, adverse effects from radio frequency at below heating levels. But ICNIRP only provide heating level limits. So they have effectively admitted there are going to be people in the country who are in a classroom who are going to be affected by the school's Wi-Fi if they simply keep to these heating limits, which ICNIRP has, which is what the UK government does through the Health Security Agency. What ICNIRP actually says is individual governments should set their own level, which is appropriate. So if you apply that to schools, then each school needs to set its own level. And that's what the Health and Safety Executive, who actually do a lot of the application of the electrical regulations in this country, have told me that yes, a school should have a non-thermal risk assessment for its premises, and especially for Wi-Fi. Then there's the new International Commission on Biological Effects of EMF. And they've looked at this and they've come to the same conclusion that ICNIRP's heating levels are not good enough. They're not protective for us all. And therefore, what they would like to do is replace the ICNIRP heating levels with actually some protective guidelines for the whole population. So that's yet to happen, but that's what the majority viewpoint, in my view, think. So my approach to this is that each school should actually look and see what it's doing in terms of this protection of its pupils, because we know that a small proportion, 1 to 3%, could be quite badly affected. And this includes the teachers, of course, people like me in the past. And then up to 30% will be partly affected in some ways. They may have bad sleep each time they've been to the school. And children don't really know why. And they therefore need to come to some sort of conclusion. Countries like France have just simply banned Wi-Fi in their infants' schools or nurseries, and they've severely limited in elementary and primary schools. So Cyprus and other countries have done that. So some countries are much more up to date on the science than what we are in the UK. And then you also have things like where there happens to be a mast just outside the school. And I mentioned to you earlier that there were a series of these studies from Sweden, which showed very clearly that just ordinary people who aren't hypersensitive, but are just ordinary folk who live in close to a mast which arrives, can suffer very severely to the point of having to leave their work or their school when the mast is put up. And one of their studies, interestingly, was of a pupil, I think he was a boy aged 8, in a school, who reported that he suffered terrible headaches and so on when he went out to play in the playground. And eventually, when it was all tracked down, they discovered it was to do with a mast, a 5G mast, which had been put up outside the school, but was beaming most strongly into that particular playground. So that's the sort of thing which, again, a school ought to be aware of. And I've seen it myself when I was teaching, how masts from the vicinity can affect pupils. And to the point where I had a number who were quite clearly ill from the effects of these masts transmitting to other people's phones, but a long way away. You couldn't see them at all. You just have to be aware of the background and the configuration of the geography in that case, because it was outdoors. So again, a school needs to be aware whether it has a problem with nearby masts. And that's why the Stewart report in the year 2000 said that whenever local planners were going to allow masts, they needed to consult with a school, the governors, the head teacher and parents, whether over a mast which was proposed close to a school where the beam might fall with maximum intensity onto the school, because that can have as I say, a very catastrophic effect for some people, and indeed for everyone, even if they can't hear it.
Well, you mentioned that in France it is heavily restricted, and a couple of other places as well. For schools in the UK that might want to keep the facility of an internet connection but lose the Wi-Fi technology, what alternatives would offer the same functionality with limited exposure?
The obvious one, of course, is to use wiring, Ethernet cables. And that's what I do at home and what a lot of people do. It's much more obviously secure and economic. We're spending a vast amount of money and energy resources now on these wireless transmitters. Clearly, from the point of view of a school, there are some who think it's more convenient to be able to walk around and put their laptop down wherever they want. But we found with smoking, with asbestos, really you do actually have to think in the bigger grand scheme of things, not over just your convenience and what you particularly enjoy, or it's a fraction cheaper. So some schools have gone down, but only a very small number, down the route of hard wiring. And that would be a very obvious thing to do, so that rather like if you want to plug your laptop in to charge it, you have to plug it into a socket in the wall. If you want to connect with the internet, you plug it into a socket in the wall. It's as simple as that, and you can run them into the desks and so on. Another way to, obviously, to reduce it would be to simply switch it off when you don't need it. So rather than have the signal running all the time in the classroom, just if the teacher particularly wants at a particular point, they switch it on and they switch it off again. And that's very easily done. A lot of people do that at home anyway to give them better chance at night and so on. A new thing which is coming in is a device called Wi-Fi, where you use LED lamps to shine down into a receiver on the laptop. And no one's yet fully studied the health effects of that. And it could be because light is another electromagnetic field system, a radio frequency, just like Wi-Fi. It could be there are downsides to that. But at the moment, it looks as though the health effects are less, they're reduced compared with the Wi-Fi, which we know very definitely can cause cancers and other neurological problems, as I say. So that could be a possible solution for the future, that it would allow you to move around. But I think basically the school has to make up its own mind what they regard as an acceptable level of risk. And also, of course, of equality, because for those very few children and staff who are badly affected, it then becomes an issue about access to all areas of the school. And really, these days, we ought to be able to allow everyone to go everywhere and not limit the facilities in the school, access to different parts, only to those who don't react to this particular toxin, which we're spewing out over so much of the country. And in terms of disability in schools, if it's physical, like these days, so wheelchair access, where possible, schools would try to make that available. And so the same ought to be done for this issue over Wi-Fi and radio frequency signals, that really they need to be restricted or replaced so that actually all people can access all areas all the time and not have it limited to just some people.
If anyone listening to this is concerned that this might be affecting their life, if it's maybe connecting a couple of dots for them, where can people find out more about you, about the EHS charity, and more about technology that might be of interest to maybe make their lives a little bit more comfortable?
There are numerous websites. The charity I am involved with is called Electrosensitivity UK, abbreviated to ES-UK, and the website is es-uk.info. So plenty of information on it and plenty of backup scientific studies. So it's really just a matter of becoming aware of it. Sadly, the press doesn't like talking about it because, of course, much of their income comes from things like mobile phones and other uses of wireless. But it is actually quite a big issue for every single school to grapple with and decide what's appropriate for them, actually carry out some sort of risk assessment. There are websites actually dedicated to Wi-Fi and schools and things like that, and quite a number of groups who are active on that front. So I'm sure people can find out more if they wish.
And if there's anyone who you would hope that this message reaches in terms of either the public or clinical professionals or policymakers, what would those takeaway messages for those kind of different levels of potential influence be?
I think it has to apply to every school. There should be a governor who has particular responsibility for health and safety. Obviously, the head teacher is ultimately responsible for health and safety, and they may wish to delegate it to someone else. But all these people need actually to look at the science, look at the evidence, and do the research for themselves. Because at the moment, the UK HSA only provides heating limits. And as I explained several times, heating is not the problem when it comes to cancers, to electrosensitivity, to neurological effects, Parkinson's, even autism, ADHD, chronic fatigue. All sorts of things can be made worse by having radio frequency present. Certainly multiple sclerosis, where you have demyelination and things like that. So it actually is a big issue, and every single school needs to take that on board. Individual teachers need to be aware that their pupils may be affected. Individual teachers need to be aware that their colleagues may be affected, or the parents could be affected as well. So it's something which society needs to take much more care over.